Hello everyone, this is Nitpicking Nerd and I just watched the new episode of Star Trek Discovery called In the Valley of Shadows. And it was a pretty average episode of Star Trek Discovery, as always, having a whole bunch of things which annoyed me. A lot of lens flares, a lot of stupid things that don't make sense, all kinds of magic fantasy nonsense, but there was one scene in particular which was actually great and awesome, and if you saw the episode you probably can guess what scene I'm talking about. And I'm giving a spoiler warning for anyone who might want to watch it in the actual episode before I spoil it, because maybe it will actually ruin that scene. Even though it wasn't totally unexpected, I could kind of see it coming, and even though that event is not supposed to happen for years to come, but I knew they will somehow want to show it in some way, and also they alluded to this in a few episodes. They kind of left clues, foreshadowing of this, and that scene is the fate of Pike. And I have to give credit where credit is due. That scene was absolutely perfect in my opinion. I can't imagine it being done any better. It was creepy, it was the stuff of nightmare, it was dramatic, it was emotional because we got to know this character in this show, so we actually care about him somewhat. I think Pike is one of the only good characters on the show, even though I will mention a few flaws with his character, things that did bug me about him in the show, but overall he's a nice character and we got to know him a little bit, so seeing that scene was very dramatic, emotional, and kind of nightmarish and creepy, and I'm a fan of horror movies and stuff like that, so I really loved that scene. And so for me personally, probably it's one of the best scenes of the entire series so far, and it definitely elevates this whole episode to above average. And the scene I'm talking about is the scene in which Pike sees his own future because he goes to Boreth to find the time crystal, and I guess it's like the Bajoran orbs in Deep Space Nine, which were sent to them by the prophets, who are non-linear aliens living inside a wormhole beyond linear time. So these orbs can show you the past, the future, so I guess these time crystals are kind of the same way. Actually, I think maybe they should have directly tied these crystals to that. Maybe they should have mentioned something about them being found near the Bajoran system, so I actually wouldn't mind if they directly tie it with that. And the way they used them in this episode was like the visions in Deep Space Nine, whenever someone would look into that orb. And so Pike touches a crystal and then he sees a vision of that accident in which he gets disfigured. My only problem with this whole thing is that wouldn't that mean he would be able to prevent that accident from happening if he knows it's going to happen? Especially since he saw too much. If he just saw little glimpses and he didn't know exactly how it's going to happen, maybe it would make sense. But I think they kind of showed too much. They showed him being in engineering, which looked exactly like the one in Discovery, by the way, and he saw the other crew members there and so on. So wouldn't he be able to know when it's going to happen when he actually gets to that ship later on? And then he reappears in the corridor and he feels his own face and it's normal, but then he suddenly hears a strange sound behind him, and we hear that kind of mechanical breathing as if someone is on life support, very creepy sound, and then he turns around and he sees someone in that mechanical wheelchair. You know where this is going. So at that point when I heard that breathing, even before that when he was standing in the corridor, I knew what's going to show up in the other side. So I actually did love that scene. I admit this scene is one of the best scenes of the show. I have to give it credit because it was so well done. And then he approaches that wheelchair. He recognizes himself, he screams in horror, and the wheelchair version of him, his face is melting and stuff, and it looks kind of similar to the original, but even better, so I don't actually mind that. As I said many times before, I don't mind some visual changes if it's done better, if they actually use the same idea and improve upon it, then it can be great, and this is a good example of how stuff like that should be done. So the wheelchair is exactly the same idea, the same spirit. It fits with the dialogue, it's simply visually more realistic, much more better looking, and the makeup itself was similar enough in my opinion that I don't complain about it. And actually it was even better, it was even more creepy, and so I don't actually have a problem with that. And a few episodes ago I complained about how the Talosians look less creepy in the new version, despite it supposedly being better special effects. And the disfigured woman looked less horrible than the original version, so I was complaining about that. But in this case they actually made it more horrible, more nightmarish, more creepy, and that's a good thing. So this is an example of a good remake. So after I got this out of the way, let me now talk about the rest of the episode, which unfortunately wasn't as good. And in the beginning of the episode we see Amanda again, and she is probably the most useless and annoying character in the entire show in my opinion. Just a total waste of time. Then there's a scene between Pike and Michael, and once again Michael is cutting off Pike and contradicting what he's saying and kind of asserting her dominance. I don't know what the hell they're doing with this. Pike was pretty well done on the show. I love the way they tried to show him as the ideal Starfleet officer with very high morals and all that stuff. That's great. And the actor is great, and the character is very charismatic, and a lot of things are good about Pike. But one flaw that he has on the show is that constantly he's kind of forgiving his officers whenever they challenge his authority. He doesn't seem to mind. So that kind of makes him look too weak, that he doesn't maintain discipline. And especially with Michael, and in this scene specifically, she cuts him off mid-sentence, doesn't even let him finish the sentence, and saying that his speculations are not productive. So this kind of attitude would never have flown in any of the other Star Trek shows. I can't imagine any of the other captains not reacting to this kind of attitude in front of other people. If it's in a private conversation, maybe, but not in front of other officers. No one ever challenged the authority of their captain in that way, and not get some kind of response from the captain. Even when Data was temporarily the captain, and Worf had an attitude, that they immediately called him to the ready room and kind of reprimanded him, and said that Captain Picard would never have tolerated that kind of behavior. And even though I often say, Starfleet is not really supposed to be a military organization, it's not supposed to be like the army, it should be more relaxed and so on, but you cannot just relax it all the way. You have to have some kind of chain of command, some kind of discipline. And so very often in the show, Pike is like totally pathetic in the way that other people kind of disregard his orders, cut him off mid-sentence, telling him to his face in front of other officers that his speculations are not productive and are a colossal waste of time. I'm quoting what Michael told to Pike after cutting him off mid-sentence in front of other officers. So anyway, they detect another red signal, which by the way makes no sense. They said from the very beginning that they detected 7 red signals, and yet ever since then in this whole season they keep picking up another new signal, and they seem to be counting the number of times they encounter a red signal, and they say only 3 are left until they get to the 7. So all of this doesn't really make sense. I mean, they detected all 7 signals from the start of the season. So are those the same signals that disappear and appear in other places? Like, it's not very clear the way it's been done. They follow these signals. I mean, they showed the galaxy in the beginning of the season, and the signals appear to be all over the galaxy. And yet now everything is around Federation space. So those cannot be the same signals they detected early on, and obviously they only now know where they are, so it's very unclear the way they set it up, and they're counting how many signals are left till the whole 7. So anyway, another red signal appears, and then they want to follow it again, and then they sport jump to the planet Boreth in Klingon space, and they have to ask permission from the Klingon Chancellor L'Oreal, who now looks more like a Jem'Hadar soldier than a Klingon. And she gives them permission to go to Boreth, even though Boreth is supposedly kind of independent from the Empire. It's kind of unclear. And the planet also doesn't really match how we saw it in TNG. We saw it in one episode called The Rightful Heir. And the planet itself doesn't really look very similar. Here it looks more like the planet Char in StarCraft, which is all volcanic and stuff. That's the way it looks like here, but it's not how it looked like in TNG. But maybe they terraformed it, a century later, maybe it looks different because they modified the weather there, so I don't have a huge problem with that. And the monastery on the planet also looks a bit different, but at least it's in the same spirit, so I don't have a huge problem with that. And it does look kind of cool and stuff. There was a scene of Pike climbing some stairs to go to that monastery, and that scene really reminded me of a scene in Batman Begins. So I guess it's another example of this show kind of copying cool scenes from other movies and trying to imitate them on this show. And then Pike talks to a Klingon who looks like he's the leader of this place, and he wears something on his head that looks like something out of Babylon 5. And he leads Pike to their crystal caves, because apparently it's revealed that this place is also guarding time crystals, which the Klingons have from somewhere, guarding them in this place, even though this place is supposed to be a place to worship Kahless. And also it's funny, whenever they mention Kahless in this episode, they don't say Kahless, they say Kalish. And it was said a few times in this episode by a few different characters, and they all said Kalish instead of Kahless. So suddenly it's revealed they also guard time crystals here, and I predicted they will have to get a new time crystal because the one in the Red Angel suit was destroyed. We saw that previously, so they would have to get a new time crystal. So anyway, they go to the time crystals, and then the stupidest part happens when the adult albino Klingon reveals that he is actually the son of Vok and L'Oreal, even though he was only left there a few months ago as a baby. And then Pike asks how is this possible, and the guy says that time moves differently there because of the time crystals. So this doesn't really make any sense, because let's assume there is some kind of time dilation effect in some of those caves with the crystals. Fine, I could maybe accept that. but he was left there as a baby. Are you telling me they immediately put him next to the crystals so that he will guard them as a baby, and then he grew up there, by himself with a few Klingons in a cave? Like, none of this really make any sense. And also, as they're walking there through a corridor, they see some other Klingons plant some trees, and then those trees magically grow up fast. So time is not moving faster, because for them time is normal, and only the trees grow up faster. So I guess it's very selective. So shouldn't Pike have aged a few years while he was down there? And so this whole scene doesn't really make sense, and also it's kind of pointless. I mean, what's the point to make that priest character into the son of Vok and L'Oreal? Unless he's going to be a character later on, which he doesn't seem to be. And so what was the point of this whole story? What was the whole point of that Klingon baby? Why couldn't this simply be a new Klingon character? What's the point to try to tie all of this with Vok and L'Oreal? So all of this was totally pointless. Then the scene with Pike happens, and I wonder what people who never saw the original Star Trek would think about this, because technically it's also a bit pointless if you don't know what happens later on in the original Star Trek. Then it wouldn't really make any kind of sense to you, I guess. But I do think it was a good scene, just as a scene, as the way it was done, artistically, visually, emotionally. It was a good scene, and it was alluded to earlier in this show, so I guess everyone would get it. But would it serve any kind of purpose later on in the overall story? Probably not, and therefore technically it's still kind of pointless, but it was a cool scene, so I do give them points for that. Meanwhile, on Discovery we see the crew in the mess hall having some fun at lunch, and we see Linus again, who is a pretty funny alien. I would have actually wanted to see more of him. And we see the genius engineer lady again, and then she sees that Stamets is upset about his lover not wanting him anymore, and then she goes to sickbay to talk with him, to try to convince him to get back with Stamets. And she tells him that she also had a wife who died in the Klingon War, and she tells him, you have a second chance, don't mess it up, and that's all. So that was a pretty kind of short pep talk, not really that meaningful. Another funny line by that woman when she was talking to the doctor was when she said something about a vegan steak. That doesn't really make sense. If they have replicators, then wouldn't all food be considered vegan, because it's not real meat? So that line didn't really make sense, but whatever. By the way, they're not even supposed to have replicators yet. The food slots were not exactly replicators. I made a whole video about that once. But on this show it did seem to function like a normal replicator in TNG time. So the line of having a vegan steak doesn't really make sense. Meanwhile, Michael and Spock go looking for the Section 31 ship all by themselves in a shuttle, and they explain that they don't want to take the Discovery there because Section 31 wants the data from the Discovery computer, which they still cannot delete for some stupid reason, even though they could have transferred it to somewhere else. So if they could have transferred it, why can't they transfer it to some other computer outside of the ship and then blow it up? It doesn't really make sense. So Michael and Spock go on a small shuttle all by themselves against Section 31, and I keep thinking, where the hell is the rest of Starfleet? How come no one else comes to their help? Where are all the other ships? They mentioned they have thousands of ships, so what the hell is the rest of Starfleet doing all this time? And where is Admiral Kathleen Kennedy? Why did she disappear? Why doesn't she get some more ships to help out instead of going with a shuttle against the Section 31 ship? And once again they drop out of warp in the last possible second before colliding with a bunch of stuff, which always makes me laugh on this show. Apparently they always fly blind, they have no idea where they're flying, they cannot see anything in front of them, and then they drop out of warp and immediately collide with stuff. So that means another nanosecond more, and they would have collided with all of that at warp, which probably would have caused a lot of damage, right? So it doesn't really make sense. And they collide with a whole bunch of bodies, which got ejected from the Section 31 ship, which was taken over by the AI, and they beam up one of the bodies, which is still alive, because he did wear some protection. And it turns out to be someone we saw in the very first episode of Discovery and forgot about and never would have recognized if they didn't even mention that. So that makes me think once again, what is the point of this? Totally pointless to tie this character with some extra that was on the bridge in the first episode of season 1. There was kind of an explanation for that later, because this whole thing was a trap by the evil AI. So that's why the AI picked the person that it knew Michael knew from the past and would trust him better. It's still a pretty big coincidence that the Section 31 ship had the exact same person that Michael knew from season 1. But still, I think it doesn't really even matter to the audience, because we don't know him, so what do we care? Also, why didn't they simply beam a bomb to the Section 31 ship to destroy it? What's the whole point to go on board the ship and try to mess with its systems? Isn't it obvious that it's a bit dangerous? So I would have simply beamed over a nuke and that's it. And of course it turns out to be a trap, and the guy that Michael trusts turns out to also have been assimilated by the evil AI nanoprobes. And also they said something about the AI only protecting itself after they try to shut it down. So that line really reminded me of Terminator 2. And as I said before, I feel like a lot of the stuff with this evil AI was really directly inspired by the Terminator movies, because there's a lot of similarities, even visual similarities. And now this guy that was assimilated by this AI, after Michael discovers it and she shoots at him, and it looks exactly like the T-1000 special effect, and then all those nanoprobes flow out of him and he's like a liquid metal kind of thing. So that really reminds me of the T-1000. So once again, a similarity to the Terminator franchise. I was actually going to make a compilation with all of the similarities, and I keep postponing it because I know there will be more. I know they will have even more scenes of that. Maybe in the last episode they will throw the evil AI into molten lava because, you know, just like Terminator 2. So I keep postponing my compilations of all of this because I know I will have to add more stuff to it later. But I am collecting all that stuff, and I will release a whole bunch of compilations in the end of the season on my second channel. And I kind of half expected them to rip off Space Odyssey. I expected to see a scene of someone shutting down the computer, floating into some Jeffries tube, trying to disconnect the computer while the computer talks with it. But they didn't do it for some reason. So it all turns out to be a trap, and the evil AI tries to assimilate Michael using a needle to stab her in the eye, because apparently that's the only way you can assimilate people now, by stabbing them directly in the eye. If it really turns out to be the origin of the Borg, which I really hope it's not, I guess it will explain the fetish the Borg always had to stabbing people in the eye and taking one eye out. So now the evil AI is always trying to stab people in the eye to infect them with nanoprobes. And by the way, nanites are not even supposed to exist yet in Starfleet technology, because I remember in season 3 of TNG, nanites were mentioned as some kind of brand new technology which most people didn't hear about. They all had to be briefed about it because supposedly it's a brand new technology. And yet in this show apparently it existed a century earlier, but you know, maybe the AI itself developed it, so I guess it's possible. So they managed to defeat the evil AI nanites by magnetizing the floor, which really reminded me of Terminator 3. And that's pretty much it. So overall an average episode, except that one scene with Pike which was creepy as hell, but I love it. So that's pretty much all I have to say. Let me know what you think about all of this in the comments below and we can discuss it. And I will see you all next time. Bye bye.